My name is Sophia, and on a cold night in December of 2022, I had a near-death experience where I firmly believe that Jesus himself showed me the dangers of technology in my generation. If you are a parent or have young people in your family, please listen to this warning. I didn't even believe in this stuff before that life-changing night, and now I found this channel so I can warn as many adults and young people as possible. And please comment below if you believe me, if you agree or disagree with this vision. So here we go. It was a normal Friday night. I was laying down on the couch in our living room, scrolling endlessly through my phone. TikTok, Instagram, YouTube. I was trapped in an endless cycle of content that didn't seem to mean much, but somehow I couldn't stop. Hours passed without me realizing it. My parents had gone to bed, my brothers and sisters were in their rooms, and I was alone with the glow of my screen. I felt a strange dizziness come over me, like the room was spinning. I thought maybe I had stared at the screen for too long, or maybe my blood sugar was too low. I told myself I'd just get up and get some water, but before I could move, everything went black. The next thing I knew, I wasn't in my living room anymore. I was floating above my body, staring down at myself. There I was, slumped over on the couch with my phone still glowing in my hand. I felt panic and confusion. Was I dead? What was happening? I tried to cry out, but no sound came. That's when a blinding light filled the room, cutting through the darkness like nothing I'd ever seen. I turned to look, and there he was, Jesus. He didn't look like the pictures in church or the paintings you see in Sunday school. He was more radiant, more powerful, and more real than anything I had ever known. His presence wasn't just light, it was love and authority all wrapped into one. I wanted to fall to my knees, but I couldn't move. "Come," he said, extending his hand toward me. His voice was calm, but it carried a weight that left no room for argument. Without hesitation, I reached out and took his hand. The moment I did, the room disappeared, and we were standing in what felt like a void. It wasn't empty, though. All around us were glowing screens hovering in midair. Phones, tablets, computers, TVs, even VR headsets. They weren't just devices. They were alive with something dark and sinister. Faces stared back at me from those screens, millions of them, but their eyes were blank. It was like they were hypnotized. Jesus gestured toward the screens. "This is the battlefield," he said, his voice filled with both sorrow and urgency. "The enemy has made this his primary weapon against your generation. Millennials, Gen Z, and Gen Alpha. He knows your potential. He knows what you could accomplish for my kingdom, so he is working to destroy you." I didn't understand. But how? It's just technology. It's just entertainment. Jesus turned and looked at me, and I'll never forget the sadness in his eyes. "It started that way," he said. "But what you see as harmless is far from it. The enemy uses these screens to enslave hearts, minds, and souls. Technology was meant to be a tool, but it has become a trap." I looked closer at the screens and saw chains extending from them. The chains wrapped around people's wrists, necks, and even their hearts. Some people were shackled so tightly they could barely move. Each chain had a word written on it: comparison, anxiety, lust, distraction, pride, envy. The words burned into my mind. "They don't even know they're chained," I whispered. "That's the enemy's greatest trick," Jesus replied, "to enslave them without their knowledge." As I stared at the screens, they suddenly turned red. Flames flickered at the edges, and I saw a terrifying symbol glowing on every screen. It wasn't just on the devices, though. It started to appear on people's foreheads and hands, as if being burned into their skin. "What is that?" I asked, my voice shaking. Jesus looked at me with a seriousness that made my heart stop. "It is not yet the mark of the beast," he said, "but it is conditioning them to accept it. The enemy is preparing their hearts to worship him instead of me. They are being trained to value convenience, approval, and instant gratification above all else. When the time comes, they will accept the mark without question." I couldn't breathe. I thought about how many hours I had spent staring at my phone, how many times I had felt worthless because of what I saw online. I thought about the arguments I had with my parents when they told me to put my phone down. I had always thought they were overreacting. Now I wasn't so sure. The scene shifted, and I found myself standing in what looked like a massive war zone. It wasn't a physical battlefield with guns and soldiers, though. Instead, it was filled with families. Parents, grandparents, children, teens, all of them were standing on one side of the battlefield, but they weren't fighting together. The older generations were yelling at the younger ones, accusing them of being lazy, selfish, and addicted. The younger generations were yelling back, blaming their parents for not understanding or for creating the very problems they were dealing with. Meanwhile, the enemy stood in the shadows, laughing as he sowed division. "They are supposed to be united," Jesus said, his voice heavy with sadness. "But the enemy has turned them against each other. The older generations must wake up and see that their children and grandchildren are under attack. They must fight for them, not against them." "How?" I asked. "What can they do?" "They must pray," Jesus said. "They must teach my word. They must set an example by putting me above all else, even their own distractions. Many of them have been lulled to sleep by the same devices." I looked around and saw older people glued to their phones too, scrolling through news or playing games while their children wandered into the darkness. The next thing I saw broke my heart. It was a church service, but it wasn't like any church I had ever been to. The sanctuary was filled with people, but most of them weren't paying attention. Some were scrolling on their phones during worship. Others were taking selfies during the sermon. The pastor was preaching passionately, but his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The glow of screens filled the room like an artificial light, drowning out the presence of God. "This is my house," Jesus said, his voice trembling with both anger and sorrow. "But it has become a marketplace for distractions. My people no longer seek me with their whole hearts. They seek entertainment, validation, and convenience." I wanted to scream, to cry, to shake everyone awake, but I couldn't. I turned to Jesus, desperate for answers. "What can I do?" I asked. "I'm just a kid." Jesus placed his hand on my shoulder, and his eyes met mine. "You are more than you think you are," he said. "You are my messenger. I have chosen you to warn them. Not just your generation, but all generations." "But they won't listen," I said, tears streaming down my face. "They'll think I'm crazy." "They rejected me too," he said. "But some will hear, and their eyes will be opened. Speak boldly. Tell them what you have seen. Warn them that the time is short." In that moment, I felt the weight of his words settle on my heart. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I knew I couldn't stay silent. In an instant, I was back in my living room. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the tears on my face. My phone was still in my hand, but it felt different now, cold, heavy, and sinister. I threw it across the room and fell to my knees, crying out to God. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I prayed like I had never prayed before. I prayed for my friends, my family, my generation, and even for the older generations. I prayed that God would help me find the courage to share what I had seen. If you're reading this, I believe it's because Jesus wants you to hear this warning. This isn't just about kids and their phones. It's about all of us. The enemy is using technology to distract, divide, and destroy. He is conditioning us to accept what's coming, and if we don't wake up, it will be too late. Parents, grandparents, older friends, you have a role to play. Pray for your children and grandchildren. Talk to them about these things. Set an example by putting down your own devices and seeking God first. And to my generation, don't let the enemy steal your soul through a screen. Seek Jesus. Read His Word. Find your worth in Him, not in likes, comments, or followers. The time is short. The choice is yours.